Hello, Internet. Today I'm going to talk about Herodotus' Histories. My edition was translated by Aubrey de Sélincourt and edited and revised by John Marincola. Now, for those of you who don't know, Herodotus' Histories is his account and his history of the Greco-Persian War, and specifically Xerxes' invasion of Greece. Now, for an actual biography on Herodotus, he was born in around 485 BC in Halicarnassus, which at the time was part of the Persian Empire. And even then, Herodotus would have likely seen the Persian Empire preparing to invade Greece, or at least in open hostilities with Greece. Now, when Herodotus was writing the histories, the Greco-Persian War had already happened, and even the Peloponnesian Wars were already happening or already finished by that time. By this point, Greece was pretty split amongst itself, but, Herodotus was still writing anyway. Now, about the actual writing itself, Herodotus divides it into 10 books, which have been named after the Muses, historically, and each book is like a little section of history. It's not clear how much time it takes, but it's just a little section, a little division of his writing. Now, Herodotus has a very distinct style of writing history. For one, he's called the father of history because his work is the first quote-unquote work of history in the West. But his style of writing is not so much history as it is storytelling. It is abundantly clear within the first book alone that he's not really writing a history so much as he is writing stories. Because the way he put it all together, he went around traveling and, just asking people what they knew, what they thought, stories he could get from them, and he compiled them all into the histories combined with whatever other knowledge he had about the wars. But his writing does not only focus on the invasion of Greece by Xerxes, it also goes through the rise of the Persian Empire and how they got to the point of invading Greece. It goes from Cyrus the Great taking over the Median Empire and overthrowing Croesus and king of Lydia. And then it'll also go through the rule of Cambyses and Darius, all the way to Darius' son Xerxes, who actually invaded Greece. Herodotus just writes at length about a bunch of subjects, like how he spends an entire book talking about Egypt and its culture and its history and some random anecdotes. Now he'll spend another book talking about the Scythians and then how Darius invaded them, and then he'll spend more time talking about random anecdotes between Sparta and Argos and Athens, and it's a very convoluted mess. He talks a lot about things that aren't actually pertinent to the Greco-Persian War and the invasion of Greece, but he still adds them because he wants to lay everything as clearly and plainly as possible. He dedicates himself to just telling it as it is, which is in its own right admirable in his honesty and integrity, but on the other hand, it's not really history if he's just telling stories. Herodotus differs from Thucydides in the way that Thucydides wrote a much more scientific history on the Peloponnesian War than Herodotus wrote on the Greco-Persian War and the invasion of Greece. Herodotus does not actually write in a scientific and studied manner like Thucydides or even a modern historian would, but rather he really just goes heavy with here's a story, I'm going to tell it to you. And he just does that a lot. And sometimes they're entertaining, and sometimes they're absolutely frustrating to get through, because he might just spend pages talking about a random tribe or random village or random island, and then he'll get back to what he was talking about. And it gets very distracting and frustrating at times because he just keeps doing this. And while there are some entertaining ones, like For example, the story of Hippocrates and how he doesn't care. It is ultimately frustrating because he keeps doing this. He does not stop deviating from what he originally set out to do. And he even does this from the first page alone. He starts off talking about how he'll talk about the Greco-Persian War, and then he immediately talks about Croesus, which is relevant to the Persian Empire. But then he talks about other things like Croesus's children and Croesus's rise to power, and also Croesus's dialogue with Solon. And this dialogue with Solon is also very important because it is almost like a manifestation, a representation of the whole work itself, because chronologically, it's impossible for Solon to have spoken to Croesus. But I read in the introduction that Herodotus' listeners and readers at the time probably understood that it wasn't supposed to be taken literally, and supposed to be more like a fable or a myth, or something akin to that. It's not meant to be taken for concrete fact, but more like something to get a moral from, or just something to simply set the scene. And he just does this. There's just no getting around it. He just talks at length about things that aren't really important to the grand scheme of things, but they're just interesting to him, and he just tells them. The actual Greco-Persian War itself does not start until about halfway through the work, and around book 5 or 6. And even then, he'll continue to just talk about things that aren't actually pertinent. But he also talks about important things, like how Xerxes crossed over into Greece, who's on which side, battles such as Thermopylae and Artemisium, and the burning of Athens, and also the famous Athenian Themistocles, who was instrumental in winning the war itself. And he eventually does finish, and he eventually gets to a point where Persia has been fended off and Greece has emerged victorious despite the damage and the scars and the later political issues that will arise from having Athens and Sparta being the new superpowers in Greece. But overall, he just gets distracted a lot, and it's really hard to focus on the events when he just keeps getting distracted and keeps talking about things that don't really matter. Now, his writing style itself, it's entertaining to a point. And it's nice to just hear stories, but when they come one after another and they keep splicing up the story, it gets very distracting. The actual translation itself, I did really enjoy. I thought it was very simple, but not too simple. That is perhaps a very awkward way of putting it. But it's definitely something you can read and listen to and not be bored by because it's too complex or it's too simple. There are other translations out there, but I think Sélincourt does a good job expressing the frankness that I believe Herodotus probably went for with his work, even though he does interject a lot. I think overall, it's not a bad work, but it's not something that you should read if you're really trying to get a feel for the story. I think it's more if you want something to relax and not think too much about, because there's just a lot that goes on that isn't really that helpful. It's just almost like fluff, but it's not that bad. Overall, I'd say it's a 3 out of 5. Maybe it'll change in the future when I am more accepting of his writing style and how he interjects and goes off course. But for now, I think I'm going to go with 3 out of 5 for this. I'm probably going to review Wuthering Heights next, and when I do, there will be a video for that, so see you then.